Welcome to Old Path and our studies through the Old Testament. We are currently in the book of Job, and we get to chapter 10 today, and we'll probably cover about 3 chapters. And before we get started here, I know I probably mention this just about every week at some point during it, but let me do it at the front end of this. When we come to the text, whether it's this book or any other book in the Bible, of the 66 that we have, there are times that we're going to be reading about things that are historical in nature, and what we want to do is understand the text, and then at the end of that, what we want to be able to do is take away from it, how do we make application to what it is that we've just read, what we've learned, and what we've just studied, and so what does it mean to us after all these years? Now, different books offer different things to us as we look through them, and when you start to read the historical accounts of things that had taken place, you're going to tend to more look at them in the way of application. So great, it's not New Testament doctrine, it's not something like what Paul would have written, and it's not for the people who have been redeemed because of the work of Jesus. This is long before that. It's not a history like what we have of Israel, and at a time when, so like from the time of Moses, when God begins to reveal to them and give them the law. You're going to study through those things a little bit different because the application to it really kind of pertains more to, well, the things that we see in the Old Testament, especially when it came to the things of the law, are matters of application because they had, in the New Testament, they were going to be seen in a much different light. It would be a full illuminating of why they did those things. And sometimes we'll call those types. There were types in the Old Testament. So again, the sacrificial system and the blood being shed for the guilt of the sinner and the innocence of the animal that was put to death. It was the blood that atoned. So we understand the idea of blood atonement and covenants. And so all of that really comes into focus because of what we see in the giving of the law, and then during the time of the prophets, and what happens when they rebel against the law. All those kind of things are really, really important in a New Testament understanding because we have the complete picture by that time. So when you start to go back and look at a book like this, and it predates the giving of the law, I really have no doubt about that we're looking at times that are kind of more contemporary to Abraham, and Abraham's basically 500 years before the law. If we're looking at that time, again, we have to ask ourselves, what did they know about God? There wasn't anything that we know of that was written like what we have with Moses and the giving of the law and all those things. Moses looks back in history and he gives that bit of information to you, really from Genesis to the beginning of creation, as God shows him those things. But the writings of Moses deal primarily with what happened from the time of the Exodus onward and the giving of the law. So it really kind of recounts that history of basically the 40 years from their exodus out of Egypt until they came into the promised land. And so we learned so much through that. But again, back to Job. What can we learn from this? And what is the application that we get from it at this point? Now, let me point out some things that are going to be pretty evident here in these chapters. Remember, by this time, you've had Eliphaz, you've had the things that Job says, and the 3 of these men are there listening. And I believe also, I don't think it's really much of a stretch, that as Job is having this dialogue with these guys, they're all present. And so there you can see little bits and pieces. If you really carefully examine side by side the things that are said, there is some repetition in this. And there is the quoting of what had been said earlier. And there is, again, the repetition that takes place in it as well. But what we also see from this, there's an escalation in this. And now it's becoming personal. And so Job has become very, very frustrated. And the forcefulness with his response to them and theirs to him is, again, escalating this whole thing. But again, it's all based on so much faulty assumption. So we have the ability to look back on it and go, man, these guys are saying all kinds of things, some of which is really, really good. Some of it is very, very true and demonstrable. But again, it's like with anything, if you begin with a faulty premise, there's no way to fix the problem down the line unless you come to a complete stop in your tracks and then reevaluate. Have we made some assumptions that are absolutely incorrect? At this point, they couldn't know, and I don't know what would have happened if they had asked, but why don't we see if maybe we're both on the wrong track, making assumptions here. Instead of doing that, they just kind of run headlong into it. And now it's becoming adversarial, where the people who should be there to offer comfort to him are now his inquisitors and his accusers. And so the accused, in this case Job, has plenty to say to them in reply. And so if we step back from that and say, great, what can we learn from this? Well, lots, actually. Of course, we could start to look at theology and doctrine, and the idea that good things only happen to good people and bad things only happen to bad people. That's a fallacy, and it's demonstrably wrong. And Job says as much. These guys, his counselors, won't really kind of come to that conclusion. Not yet anyway, because they're going to have to eventually understand that completely. But also the idea of counsel, and what kind of counsel should we give. So once again, prosperity doesn't come because of righteousness, like some people try to tell us, or because we've spoken things into existence, which is again a fallacy. The word faith and the new apostolics that we have among us today have a lot of bluster, and they say a lot of things, and yet there's no way that they can possibly manifest those things just because of their words. So that is spoken against clearly, and that's, again, it should be plainly obvious. Also that man has the ability to choose what he is going to do based on what he understands and what he knows of God. Again, if man did not have the opportunity to choose, then the accusation would have no merit to begin with, and God would have never gone through this whole exercise, because if God's the one who picks and chooses every outcome, then the beginning accusation would have been absurd to even ask or try to insert that, well, the only reason that he loves you is because you give him stuff. God at that point, if he makes every decision, would say, well, duh, of course he does, because yeah, I make every decision. Only if there is free will does any of this make sense. So when we start to look at it like that, again, these are the kind of things that we can take away from it. And then when we get to the place of how it is that we may very well be those people who have to come alongside someone whose life is in varying degrees of just distress and trouble, how careful we must be with the counsel that we may give. And so we want to be very, very, very conscious of that, and make sure that what we say and our counsel makes no assumptions, and we always want to be able to give what we know that we can prove. And so what we have here, just again, think about this. These guys have come to their conclusions, and again, I have to give them a little bit of leeway, at least as much as I can imagine, because they don't have what I have in front of me to know that God doesn't do things punitively. At this point, it may seem punitive to some people, or it may seem like he's obviously just destroying this man because he's done something wrong. So Job goes from one day, this righteous man, and they all know one another, to the next day, everything is wiped out. And yet these three guys are able to show up there, and their lives are in some semblance of the way that it's supposed to be. Nothing has changed with them. All that they have is him and his radical change in what's happening in his life. So obviously, they come to the conclusion that he has done something evil, he's done something wrong, and he's just simply being punished for his wickedness and his sin. Okay, it's an easy thing to come to a conclusion of, and yet it's not helpful. And so, and it's not provable. It's all assumption. So with all of that said, what we want to make sure that we take away from it is that if we're ever put in this place of being able to offer counsel or find comfort for ourselves or someone else, we can look at what took place here and to recognize that God didn't do this as some just punitive, punishment against him. It wasn't that God was not paying attention. He's not aloof, and he's not indifferent towards the suffering of mankind. All of those assumptions that sometimes are made by people, this book helps to illustrate that that's not at all the case. So what we have here is the back and forth of Bildad and Job. And we looked a little bit of that last week, and so we'll kind of jump back into the discussion in chapter 10. What we have is the furthering response of Job. And now again, it's going to become a little bit adversarial, and he's going to have plenty to say to his advisors or to his counselors, his friends, of what they were supposed to be. But they're at this point not being friends, though they may think that they are. A friend will tell you the things that you need to hear, and there's nothing wrong with that understanding. Again, if we're counseling people and we can see clearly that they're doing things that God would not approve of, it's very important that we say those and make sure that our own hands are clean at the same time. But if we see somebody in the midst of all kinds of trouble and they're wondering why they're so miserable and why there's trouble and everything else, it's like, well, let's be honest. I mean, none of us are perfect and none of us are sinless. But if a person is in a place of just practicing and it's their lifestyle of things that God would not approve of, yeah, it's up to us to say those things and compassionately do so and make sure that they don't see us as their judge, which that's usually the defense that's put up because the devil loves to give that one. So it's not about judging. It's just, here, read it for yourself. This is what the text has to say. And the idea that practicing or making a lifestyle out of that thing is going to create a problem for you. Not my words, but it's what we see in the text. So again, we don't come as the judge. We come as the person who offers, here's what the scripture has to say. Take it or leave it. If you want to just make this about a personal thing and that I'm judging, great. I can't change your mind in that, but here's what the text says. Take me out of the equation. This is how we're supposed to be able to present those things. But again, in a compassionate way, not as some school teacher that's just reprimanding them for doing all kinds of things. We want to be much more careful about how we instruct through these matters. So, with all that said, chapter 10, let's pick up there and let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your word and for what it teaches us, what we can take away from it, what we can understand. We would ask, Lord, that you would give us ears to hear what is being spoken here. And as we see the escalation in these things, once again, may we be people who can step away from it for a moment and just put ourselves into the situation here and now. When we come to a person who is in such a desperate situation as was Job, if we ever encounter someone who's in any ways like this, may we have that compassionate heart, not pretending that we have all of the answers, but offering to give comfort and peace where it can be given, to pray for them as need be. And Lord, we pray that we would have that heart again of compassion, of empathy, and that you would use us in such a way that we could minister to those around us. And so maybe even for those watching today, that you would comfort the hearts of maybe those who are going through struggles, that they may seek out what it is that you're doing in their life, that they may come to an understanding and that you would grow them through it. And we give you thanks in all these things in Jesus' name. All right, chapter 10. He says this, and this is kind of a repeat of what we saw at the beginning, the things that he says when it would just be better if I wasn't here. It's kind of a repeat of that. So he says, my soul loathes my life. I will give free course to my complaint, and I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. Now, again, remember, this is in a reply because it's escalating at this point. So, of course, he said these things, but he's not backing down from them. In fact, if anything, they're kind of throwing fuel on the fire. And so they're saying, you should be silent in this. You don't make accusations against God. You can't point the finger at him. He doesn't do these things for no reason. You're obviously the problems. Quit blaming everyone else and look at yourself. You're the problem. Well, Job at this point, again, he can hear all the things that they say, and they may think that they're so correct in this, but he knows better. I haven't done anything that I know of that has caused the problem, and he has already asserted his innocence in these things. Though at the same time, he recognizes these things don't happen on their own. I understand that, and he's going to reiterate that too. Don't talk to me as though I don't know these things. I already do. Again, good little thing for us to remember. We shouldn't be talking down to people as though they're just infants. We want to share with them what may very well be the case. And if they don't understand, great, then fine. But don't assume that they don't know these things and that we're somehow coming into the room as the authority and no one else knows anything but us. That's what's happening here. And so he says, I'm going to say the things that are obvious to me. I'm going to speak because, again, but remember how he started. How long are you going to do this? How long are you going to continue to plead your ignorance and be so boisterous about it? So he says, again, verse 1, my soul loathes my life. I will give free course to my complaint, and I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me. And again, this can be taken a couple of ways. Is this him like shaking his fist, or is this a way of him saying, with due reverence and respect, I will make these things known to him? And again, that's an important thing that we should understand as believers. When we read in the book of Hebrews where it says we can come before his throne boldly, we need to understand what the language is saying there. It's not we go barging in the door and shaking our fist and making demands of God. It means boldness can also be that of assurance. So the better picture, and I think we all understand this because the Holy Spirit would be working in us to show us otherwise if we thought we'd go barging into the throne room. we come in a place of humility, but absolutely recognizing it's not like some of the kings of history, where if you went in and they were having a bad day, you could not survive the time there with them. It isn't so with the Lord, because we've been given access to him through his Son and the finished work of Jesus in us. We can come before him in the place of boldness and assurance, but at the same time one of humility and the recognition that we have no right to ask these things of you, but we've been given access to you. It's because of Jesus that we can ask such things. Let's make sure we understand them in their proper understanding and context, and that we stand before a holy God who loves us and has given us access to him. So with that humility of mind and heart, we can come before him. And I believe that's more where Job is. But it isn't as though we can't make our hearts known to him. Again, I mentioned last week, Philippians 4. Make your requests known, and then let the peace of God that passes all understanding guard your heart and mind. But if we're anxious, let's not be. Let's not be anxious for anything, but prayer and supplication with thanksgiving make your requests known. So Philippians 4:4 through 7 or 8. Read that for yourself and see there that it's one thing that we're supposed to do is leave those things at his feet, recognizing that we don't bring them back. The moment that we hand those to him, make your requests known, we're not to grab them right back and go back to that same place of insecurity and anxiety. Rather, we're to think upon these things. And as I say all of that, I know that I have mentioned it last week and this week. Let's go to the passage. I hadn't planned on it, but let's do it. Philippians 4. We'll go through this briefly. I don't want to do it quickly, but I want to do so briefly. I don't want to rush past it. This is the condition of the heart. Verse 2 is where that starts. Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known by all men. The Lord is at hand. It's that he's present. He's there. We need to recognize that he is in our midst. So at verse 4, I started at verse 4. That was verses 4 and 5. At verse 6 is where he says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication. Lord, I come to you in the name of Jesus. My prayer, supplications are here are the matters that I bring before you. But do so with prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. God, I am so thankful that you bid me come to you. There's nothing that I'll tell you that you don't already know, but you know that I am filled with anxiety. So here I lay these things out at your feet. And then we do so. Thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God, and here's what will happen if they stay in their order. If we come before him as anxious people, laying it all before him, then it says, if that's the case, rather than you arresting it back from him, it's like we don't really give anything over to him. We're going through the motions, but we leave the room, if you will, just as filled with anxiety because we haven't really entrusted it to him. If we're doing these things as should be, the peace of God which passes all understanding will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. It means that God will give you a peace that you can't grasp. You just feel and you understand it and you know it. Your anxiety is taken because you say, I've brought it before the only one who can do anything about it. Clearly, I can't remedy the problem, or I wouldn't have had to bring it to him in the first place. So, what do you do in the meantime? And this is the important part of this. This is verse 8. Whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, and just go through the rest of the list, lovely, of good report, that are virtuous, worthy of praise, then do this. Meditate upon those things. It's the opposite of all that that causes our anxiety. If you were to look at the total flip side of these things, it would be true and noble, just, pure, lovely, that whole list. Look at the opposite of those things in that list, and you'll see what leads to anxiety and trouble and all of that stuff. So if we have created all kinds of anxiety and trouble in our hearts and minds, let's bring that before the Lord and acknowledge it. I'm filled with these things in my life, and I'm filled with anxiety as a result of it. So I give it over to you and ask God that you would help me to understand it and resolve it. Show me a different way. And let God's peace minister to you. In the meantime, don't go back, contemplating, meditating, thinking about consuming yourself with all the stuff that led you to the need for prayer. Instead, look at the things that are the counter to that, all the things of verse 8. So, with that case, what is it that we do when we come to somebody who's in a place of trouble based on what we see here with Job? They don't come to him. They don't pray for him. And again, their understanding of prayer versus ours, we don't know. So it's hard for us to say, well, they didn't pray for him. We don't even know how that interaction would work. And again, we don't know what they may have done that is not recorded here. We just know what their counsel is. So if we see somebody in a place of trouble, filled with anxiety and trouble and all the rest of it, the great thing is we don't need to give them philosophy. We can say, you know what? Interestingly enough, the people at Philippi were more than likely going through what it is that you're going through. And here's what Paul had to say to them. Take them to Philippians chapter 4, starting at verse 4 through verse 8, and go through and recount for them what was just discussed here. So they don't have the benefit of Jesus. They don't have the benefit of the leading of the Holy Spirit as we would. They don't have the writings of Paul. They don't have the book of Philippians. They have none of those things. All that they are operating by is what they see, both Job and his counselors. So it kind of gives us an understanding why it would be. Let's go back to Job. So Job is able to say, and I believe that it is very much of a humble heart when he says this, I will say to God, do not condemn me, or make the request, please do not condemn me. It's not a command. It's not a shake your fist kind of a thing. It's a cry for mercy. Please don't condemn me. Show me why you contend with me, and does it seem good to you that you should oppress me? He's trying to understand the what's going on. What's the creation of this, and why is it necessary? If I haven't done anything wrong, what's behind this? Why does this take place? Why would it happen to me and not these guys? Is probably a good way of saying it. Probably part of why they're so animated to make it about him, because in the back of their minds, they'd have to be terrified. If it can happen to Job and he's a righteous man, what about us? Well, we're going to get to that. So, does it seem good to you to oppress me, verse 3, that you should despise the work of your hands? Your creation, Job, I'm your creation. I'm the work of your hands. And that you would smile on the counsel of the wicked, or the way of the wicked. Now, does that mean that he's directing this towards his counselors, these wicked men, as he sees them? It could have an application to them, but it seems more as he's talking about in the overall scheme of things. Because again, wicked people may prosper, as he is intimated here. We certainly know that the more that we read of the things like David, why is it the wicked prosper? And Asaph, I mentioned him last week. He said the same kind of a thing. We look all around us in our world today. Why is it that some of the most powerful people that we know among us, that we can identify by name and face, are some of the most wicked people? And why is it that they have the things that they have? And why is God not putting them in a place of humility and humbling them as he did to Job or someone else? Why should they prosper? And then people who love the Lord are just left in this place of destitution sometimes, and persecution, and all kinds of trouble. Once again, we live in a fallen creation, and whatever their life is here, of the most affluent among us, and the people who think that they are our lords, the day will come when they'll stand before the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. For us, he will not be our judge. He's our Savior. To them, he will be their judge. So it's a matter of perspective and time. So verse 4. Do you have eyes of flesh? And he knows the answers to all these questions. It's more rhetorical that he is saying these things. And you can see he's trying to work it out in his own mind. Do you have eyes of flesh, or do you see as man sees? Clearly he does not. Man can't see in the dark. God can. Literally and figuratively. Are your days like the days of a mortal man, or your years like the days of a man? That you should seek for my iniquity and search out my sin, although you know that I am not wicked, and there is no one who can deliver from your hand. It's just a statement of absolute fact. I understand these things. So a person who is genuinely wicked could not get past your glance. And again, he would recognize if there was something, it would be genuine hypocrisy. There's one thing versus about the evil person who does evil things and doesn't acknowledge God. Job is not that man. Job is a man who is being seen as upright and godly, and yet here he's having the most desperate, horrible things happen to him, and he's trying to reason it out. God, you're not like we are, and no one can escape your notice, the things that you do. So why is it, though I've acknowledged, why do my problems persist? That's in the back of his mind. Your hands have made me and fashioned me in intricate unity. David says something similar to that I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And so that recognition that they are the workmanship of his hands. Yet you would destroy me. I don't understand this. Your hands have fashioned me in intricate unity, yet you destroy me. I don't understand. So he says this, remember, I pray, that you have made me like clay, And so will you turn me then to dust again where clay comes from? You've gone to such great lengths to make me and fashion me the way that you are. So why is it that you find some pleasure in crushing me and reducing me back to where I started? So again, he sees whatever's happened to him as it doesn't make sense to him. There's not an understanding in his own mind, and this is a crying out. And he says these things. He's not addressing the people. This is an address. He is saying these things to God and trying to find an understanding in it. So he says, remember, I pray, that you have made me like clay, and will you then turn me to dust again? Verse 10, did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me as cheese? That idea that it sounds like a pretty weird way of putting it, but cheese was not in its solid form when it was just poured out as milk. It's churned and everything else, and then it begins to take form. It's his way of saying, I was just as though milk, but yet solid form can come out of that, and you get an understanding because of the other things that he says that are along that line of thought. You clothe me with skin and flesh, you knit me together with bones and sinews. But there was a time when that wasn't the case. So God takes what was just raw material that he has created, and then he fashions it into something else. You knit me together with bones and sinews. You have granted me life and favor, and your care has preserved my spirit. These things I know. I was nothing at one point, and you brought me to this place, and it's something that you have done. Now he says this on the heels of saying, you're the one who fashioned me, and I'm like clay, and yet you're going to crush me and return me to my former state. Again, you see in him this perplexity. And again, his people are his friends are listening to all this and saying, why don't you just be honest about everything? You still keep pleading that somehow you're righteous in all this, and clearly you're not. Well, they don't understand. Now, Job is at least willing to understand, or to say, I don't understand. His counselors are just completely convinced that they're right in all of their assessment. So you can see why this is going to continue to escalate between them. So, verse 13, and these things you have hidden in your heart. You've done them for reasons known to you. This is Job saying to God. I know that this was with you. If I sin, then you mark me, and I will not acquit me of my iniquity. So that you're going to recognize those things, and you're not going to forgive it without acknowledgement. So again, we want to make sure that we understand this too. God will not look past the idea of sin and just kind of look the other way in it. And we may misunderstand this a little bit in the New Testament sense, because we could say, well, doesn't he kind of do that because we're not being held responsible for our sin? Well, yeah, but to understand what it took to get it to that point. What we had deserved, the wages that we had earned, fell upon Jesus. It's not as though God looked the other way. It was something that was going to be paid for on our behalf by someone else. So the consequences of our sin have not fallen upon us, but they fell upon Jesus, who paid that willfully. We should understand that. They couldn't have possibly grasped this. Though when we get to chapter 19, we're going to find that Job has some insight about that that's just amazing when you stop to think about it. He says now in verse 15, if I am wicked, then woe to me. Even if I am righteous, I cannot lift my head. I am full of disgrace and see my misery. So this is an acknowledgement of Job. Unlike what his guys are saying, the guys that are counseling him, is that even if I could be righteous as a man could be when I stand before you in the excellence of who you are, I can't even lift my head in front of you. Now, again, the more that we understand about God's nature, and I'm going to come back to David, when David says that you're the lifter of my head, that you're a shield about me. We had that song that we used to sing way back in the day around Calvary's, and I don't hear it much anymore. But that you, O Lord, are a shield about me. You're my glory, and you're the lifter of my head. Taken from something that David had said, and what that really shows, the idea of the lifter of a head, that means that your head's down to begin with. And so David would look at God as the one who offers to him comfort, even in the time of distress, or even maybe shame and embarrassment and guilt, and it's God who looks at us, lifts our head, and we're able to behold him, because he's the one who initiates that. We're the one who brings trouble to the equation. He's the one who brings healing. So he does understand this, and those things need to be, we need to reconcile those things. God in his holiness cannot look upon sin. But because of what Jesus has done for the believer especially, we can come before him and not try to plead somehow innocence, but even in our innocence, or I'm sorry, even in our guilt, the innocence of Jesus and him being put to death and then resurrecting and paying for our sin with his blood gives us the place where we can come before the Lord, even in that time of guilt and shame, and say, you're the one who lifts my head. We couldn't do it on our own. We can't come before him proudful, chin up, and, who are you? It's always that place of humility and recognition of his holiness and his greatness. Job says it that way because he doesn't have the insight that we do. So, verse 16, if my head is exalted, and of course he could have been that guy. Look at everything that I have around me, but to recognize that it all comes from him. He says, now if my head is exalted, then you would hunt me like a fierce lion. You'd humble me. And again, you show yourself awesome against me. So he sees once again, these things will not happen on their own. That's already the counsel that he's received, and he agrees with that. So he says, you renew your witness against me, and you increase your indignation towards me. Changes and war are ever before me. So that's in a day by day. Things just go from one thing to the next. It's as though I'm being advanced upon by an army of people. Why then have you brought me out of the womb? Oh, that I had perished and no eye had seen me. And he's going to end the chapter this way, back to what he had said at the original. Why did I even come into this life if this was going to be the way that it would end? And he wants to see a hastening of those things. But again, he sees God as his oppressor, though he doesn't understand why. At the same time, he recognizes the greatness and your majesty and who you are and what you do. Yet I don't know what's put me, if you will, on your radar. And I don't know why these things are happening. I can't find anything that I have done that I have not acknowledged and sought your forgiveness, and yet the problems persist. You can see that just the frustration that comes in this. And I totally understand where he had been. I understand it by reading it. I have never experienced it, obviously. So then why have you brought me out of the womb, verse 18? Oh, that I had perished and that no eye had seen me. I would have been as though I had not been, and I would have been carried from the womb to the grave. And are not my days few? Cease and leave me to this end. Leave me alone, that I may take a little comfort. He's just saying, let this all be over. Just take my life, that it might be over. It'd been better if I had not been born. He's revisiting the things that he had said in the earlier chapters. Before I go to the place from which there is no return, that being death, to the land of darkness and the shadow of death, as land as dark as darkness itself, as the shadow of death without any order, where even the light is like darkness. And so his concept of what it would be like to be dead in this world, and yet he does realize that there is something after this. But it's the putting to an end the physical life on this earth that has just consumed him, and that's what he's referring to here. So then, Zophar, the third of these people that are going to come to him, and again, it's going to become more forceful. The third counselor says this, verse 2, should not the multitude of words be answered? And should a man full of talk be vindicated? Why would God allow you, with all of your protesting and everything else, you're a liar and you're a hypocrite? Why would God answer your prayer? Instead, he should give you what you deserve for denying that this is something that you have caused. You can see it's really taking a very sharp turn here. Should your empty talk make men hold their peace? Why should we stop saying the things that we are if you're going to just continue to deny it when you're obviously the problem? And when you mock, should no one rebuke you? So these guys are thinking, as he says this, they're looking at Job and saying, your reassertion of your innocence is mockery. You're not even listening to the things that we're saying to you, and all we want to do is offer you help, and yet you will reject it and continue to plead your innocence, when all of us know that you're a liar and a hypocrite. That's what's kind of being, if we put it into modern English, that's the kind of, the back and forth has reached this point. So again, this is now the third of his counselors, and they've all been there to hear it. So of course, it's going to become, as like an interrogation would be, you're trying to extract something from the person, and if what was said before is not enough, it was said maybe, with a little bit of compassion, a little bit of like, well, have you considered this? Now it's just straight on accusation. So verse 4. For you have said, I'm quoting you, Job, you have said that your doctrine is pure, or my doctrine is pure. I am clean in your eyes. So as I stand before you, Job, saying, I'm clean. And they're repeating back the things that he has said to them. And I am clean in your eyes. But oh, that God would speak. We know what you've told us. We're not buying it. You keep saying those things, but if God could speak like one of us, this would look a whole lot different. Look at what he says. It's pretty brutal. But that God would speak and open his lips against you. Not that he could work around all of us. This is just the arrogance of thinking we're right, you're wrong. And if God was able to show up, he would be just like us and he would point out everything that you're doing. This is ugly. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips against you, that he would show you the secrets of wisdom and that you would double your prudence. Or if he could open to your understanding what wisdom looks like, then you in reply through your prudence, it would be magnified. And basically the point is you would change your tune in a heartbeat if God could speak. So that he would show you the secrets of wisdom, for you would double your prudence. Know therefore that God exacts from you less than your iniquity deserves. You think it's bad what you've got now, it's not half of what you really deserve. Now, talk about being ridiculous and judgmental. See, again, they have no proof of their assertion. All that they can look at is say, look at all the stuff that you used to have. From your kids to your possessions to everything, even your health, it's all taken from you. So they assume from all of that Job is being chastised by God because he is not, first of all, he did something that's sinful and now he won't acknowledge it, so no wonder it gets worse. So again, a faulty conclusion based on a faulty premise and a lack of understanding. So again, I have to be reminded what they know versus what we know. I would hope that we as believers, if we see somebody in this place, that we would never come to this place of that total accusation unless we have, obviously we can point to them and show, here's exactly what you've did and everybody knows it. But they wouldn't be pleading their ignorance at that point. And then we still run into that brick wall of, does God do things punitively to people? Because if that was the case, if everybody who did some secret sin or some kind of sin was going to be paid for what they did, everybody would be kind of laid waste. So we need to be really careful about how we deal with these things. Verse 7. Can you search out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limits of the Almighty? Again, the things that he does, they're so far beyond our understanding. And this part we would all agree on. But again, his point is, God would do these things that he would do, and he's mighty beyond what we understand. Even the amount of suffering that you've gone through is limited compared to what he could do because it's so grand. So they are higher than heaven. And so what can you do? Deeper than Sheol or the grave or death. So what can know? Their measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. If he passes by, imprisons, and gathers into judgment, then who can hinder him? Everyone is powerless against him. So, and they would look at Job and say, this is what's happening to you. You can't do anything to prevent it because you have really raised his ire against you. And they would see it as your protesting otherwise just makes it worse. Don't you see he sees through all of this, Job? For he knows deceitful men, and he sees wickedness also. Will he not then consider it? So if he understands all of what you've done, you think he's not going to punish you? He's not going to look the other way. Good. We should look at this and say, again, with what we understand, God sees it all, and he's not going to look the other way. When we talk to people, we want to make sure, especially when we talk to unbelievers, we want to be able to say, God's justice will not remain silent. He looks at every person dead in sin and trespass, and there's no way out of that. In our own strength, we've caused the problem. The wages of sin is death, is what we're told, but the gift of God is eternal life in Jesus. So Romans 6:23. That's an important thing. And all have sinned, fall short of God's glory. Romans 3:23. If we understand those things, no man is able to stand before God and say, I am sinless. And because of our sin, we'll have to pay a price for that. Now, for those that would believe in Jesus, we can get the free gift of salvation because he's the one who's paid our price. It's not that we're sinless people. The wages of sin is death, and we've all produced that. Every one of us is worthy of death, period. There's no way around it. If we choose then the gift of God that he offers to us in Jesus and accept his terms for that, you can be freed from the guilt and the consequence of your sin. But here's what's going to have to take place. You'll look to Jesus, the one who has paid that price for you. So again, we're making a New Testament application to what we're reading here. God will not remain silent. And as we're talking to the unbeliever, God is a God of justice. He will then, because of his justice, have to judge those who would reject him. That's no different than what's here, because God is ultimately the judge of these things, and that's what's being said here. Verse 11, he knows deceitful man, and he sees wickedness also. Will he not then consider it? Is he going to turn a blind eye to the wickedness of men? Of course not. And all we have to do is point the person who may wonder about that, look to the cross. He clearly hasn't looked the other way. He sent Jesus to die because of this very problem. To those who would come to him, they will escape the punishment that they are due for their sinfulness. So, for an empty-headed or a vain man will then be wise in his own wisdom, when a wild donkey as a colt is born as a man. So the equivalent is an empty-headed or a vain man is so devoid of understanding. It's like looking at a colt that's just been born, or any other kind of animal that's born alive, that as soon as they're there, look at how helpless and clueless they are. They got no idea what's going on around them. They're just, an infant in a human sense is probably the best of all examples. A newborn baby really has no sense of self-awareness and doesn't for months. And so just completely clueless. And such is man when it comes to the understanding of things. So in our own wisdom, the empty-headed or the vain man will be wise. And to the same extent that a newborn animal is wise. So they're lacking it entirely. So he says this to him. If you would prepare your heart and stretch out your hands towards him, if iniquity were in your hand and you put it far away, and would not let wickedness dwell in your tents, then surely you could lift up your face without spot. If you would just acknowledge what you've done, if you would just repent of these things, acknowledge them, and bring them before God, then you could lift your head and you could stop with this charade of trying to plead your innocence. So it says, yes, you could be steadfast and you could not fear, because you would forget your misery and remember it as waters that have passed away. Now he's coming back to that same thing. You could get onto the road of healing if you would just stop with this obstinance of denial, recognize, because God sees just as well as we do, that you're the reason for the problem. If you would just acknowledge those things, then healing could come in. So, verse 17. Your life would be brighter than noonday. Though you were dark, you would be like the morning, and you would be secure because there is hope. Yes, you would dig around you and take rest in safety. And so as a person who would, before they're going to put down their self for rest, thinking about they would lie down in the dirt or whatever else, you would dig around and find the place that is of comfort and that is of safety and peace, and then you could take your rest. So you would also lie down, and no one would make you afraid. Yes, you would court your favor, or many would court your favor. Going back to the way that things were, verse 19. Verse 20, but the eyes of the wicked will fail, and they will not escape, and their hope, loss of life. That's all that they have to look forward to. So he lays it out as an either or. You can acknowledge what you've done wrong and let God begin the healing, or you can stay in your denial and your own wisdom, and you'll come to nothing. You'll just lose it all. And so there are your options. So all of that is said, and there's some merit to it, especially in an Old Testament sense, because we know now that justice and judgment, as we saw it in the Old Testament, it is somewhat deferred, best that we see here, because there's a day of judgment that's coming, and there's a recognition that what we know as believers and what the world should know is so different in this world now versus what it was in the Old Testament, and what we understand of that. And let's remember that as far as the Old Testament laws and how God was going to punish the wicked and do what he was going to do was different for those people who were under the law, because the law only pertained to them. But that doesn't mean that God has turned a blind eye towards the wickedness of mankind, even during the time of Israel and Joshua and all of that. Because again, when Israel was supposed to take the land, They were not supposed to go conquer the world. They were only supposed to take the land that was promised to them. The people occupying that land, God had a real problem with them and their wickedness, and he was going to use his people through whom he was fulfilling a promise to bring them into the land, but they were also going to be his hand of justice, meting out the judgment on the people who lived in that land because of their wickedness. So it was a twofold thing. God wanted to use them to be his hand to execute justice and judgment on the people of the land, and that he was going to make good on the promise of bringing them to that land. There was two things going on at once. So with all that said, verse 12, or chapter 12, where Job is going to give another part of his reply, and it's going to go on beyond what we can look at today. Because we're not going to get to chapter 13, but Job continues there. So in chapter 12 it says, Job answered and he said. Now, as forceful as what we saw with Zophar, as forceful as that was, it's going to be just that forceful as far as Job is concerned. So Zophar has said what he said, and it was bare knuckles, pretty harsh. Job is going to say things, it's going to be retaliated, I guess you could say. So Job answered and said, no doubt you are people with wisdom, and wisdom will die with you. This is sarcastic. This is him saying, well, you guys are the only ones who have it figured out then, right? So, little quick note. If we're having discussions with people, and if there is even some kind of debate that's going on, and it really devolves itself into its place into like sarcasm and mocking of one another, it's probably gone too far. And again, there are times when I'm in a discussion with people and it becomes a little bit contentious, and I got to try to remind myself, if it's getting to the point of sarcasm, then I'm the problem. And I'm as guilty as the next about that whole thing, because it's just so frustrating when you see something that you think is completely wrong and you think that what you're doing is completely right. You'd better know that what you're saying is biblically supported. But ultimately, it's so easy to get to that place of sarcasm, which he has done here. So he says, but you guys may think that you have it all figured out, but he says this, but I have understanding as well. I am not inferior to you. Indeed, who does not know such things as these? So the point is basically, you guys think that this is so profound, like who doesn't know this? So it's not as though you're the only ones who figure this out. Some of this is just pretty obvious. God can't look the other way. God is great. If man is wicked, God takes notice of it. Well, who doesn't know that? It's Job's way of just saying, you guys think that you're so profound. It's like, this is elementary. So you're not the only ones with understanding here. Verse 4, so I am mocked by, I am one who is mocked by his friends. Now this is pointing to them. This is what you guys are doing. I'm mocked as by the people who call themselves my friends. And he speaks of himself. I am one who called on God, and he has answered me, the just and blameless, who is then being ridiculed. There's no question that what God has done is favor towards me, and he's done favorable things. You guys somehow think that I've now run afoul of him, and yet you're completely wrong. He's been saying that all along. He goes, I want you to remember who I am. There was a time when we were all of the same, and you guys saw God's hand on me, and now you just assume that he has removed it because of something that I've done. And he's saying that's not the case. The just and blameless who is now being ridiculed. That's the assertion of his innocence yet again. I'm the just, but I'm ridiculed by you guys. Just because circumstances are different between us, he's basically mocking them for assuming that he's the problem. Again, he realizes that there's the very real problems that are going on. It's the reason why that is the total line of departure between them. Theirs is, you caused this by something that you've done that you will not own up to. Even though you know it, Job, you won't own it. Job would say, everything about my calamity is clearly from God, but not for the reasons that you think. They're even hidden from my eyes. I don't understand. But he is saying to all three of his counselors, you guys are so wrong in this. In your assertions and your assumptions, you're completely wrong. But he has to at the same time say, and I don't even fully understand it, but you're wrong. So, verse 5, a lamp is despised in the thought of those who are at ease. Your path is illuminated to you. So the idea of a lamp is useless to you. But, and by the contrast, but that it is made ready for those whose feet slip. If you can't see your way, then a lamp is something that you really want to see. And if it starts to go out, your feet are going to slip. It's just kind of a metaphor to say, you guys think that you see it all so clearly because everything is great with you. You're at ease. Wait until you start to slip as well, and the thing that you despised is going to be something that you wish that you had. So, the tents of the robbers, they prosper, and those who provoke God, they're secure in what God provides by his hand. So even the wicked, they're going to have at least provision, because if it was otherwise, God would take their life and their possessions from them. But this is that, again, just have to take a look around. Even people who don't acknowledge him will have some level of prosperity, and it's God who gives to any of them, the good and the bad, the wicked. They have life, and they may have the possessions of things because God allows it. And why he allows it and all the rest of that is the big speculation. Now, in our day and age, it's because this world is on its way to judgment. Every single person, even if they die before that happens, will still stand before him one day as judge, and this is just a part of a fallen creation. As we go to bed at night, the next day we wake up to a world that is just as dead in its sin and trespass as the day before. But it's getting closer to that day of reckoning. So, verse 7. But now ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of the air, and they will speak, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, and the fish of the sea, they will explain it to you. That point of that nature gives obvious, illustration to this, that God is the one who has created all of these things, and yet there are things that are just evident by looking around you. So, who among these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done all of these things? He's the creator of all these things. In whose hand is the life of every living thing, and the breath of all mankind. So it's obvious that something sustains all of this. Now, it's not as though animals are going to be able to speak, but the very fact that they exist, they cannot produce anything on their own. God has to make provision for them. Jesus says this at the Sermon on the Mount, very similar. The birds of the air, they don't toil, they don't have trouble, and yet God provides for their needs. And how much more valuable are you than sparrows? So that same kind of understanding. So, who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this, and in whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind? Does not the ear test words, and the mouth taste food, the sensory things, of course? These are just rhetorical questions, but they have an obvious answer. Wisdom is with aged men, and with length of days comes understanding. Experience. Time goes by. There's things that you see that the younger people may not have experienced, and you commit those things to memory. You've seen things. This is obvious. So it says, with him, speaking of God, with him are wisdom and strength. He has counsel, and he has understanding. It puts him in a place of being distant and different from man in that the book of Hebrews that we're also studying at the same time. Same kind of a thing. There are things that we can know, and there are things that are completely unknown to us, but to God they are all known at all times, and there's never a thing that God learns. He knows all these things. So it says, this is just obvious. If he breaks down a thing or a thing down, it cannot be rebuilt. If God is the one who has brought it to a ceasing of existence, it will never be rebuilt. He's the final say in these matters. So, if he imprisons a man, there is no one who can release him. If he withholds waters, they dry up. If he sends them out, they overwhelm the earth. So floods. So whatever happens, wherever God sends water, it's either going to, if it's going to be done away with, it dries up. If it's going to be sent forth, it floods. With him are strength and prudence. He deceived, and the deceiver, they are his. They can deceive mankind. They cannot deceive him. He's the governor of them all. He leads counselors away plundered, and he makes fools of judges. Now, this is speaking of you look at this and go, since these guys are his judges, and these are the guys who are giving this counsel, is this directed at them? Well, everything else he says here is just general as far as humanity is concerned. However, if he makes these blanket statements, but if something applies to them, then yeah, they're just as guilty of this. And so you wonder if they were kind of listening to all this, and then that one hit a little close to home. He loosens the bonds of kings, the bonds that kings would put on people. He's able to break those chains. He binds their waist with a belt. So the kings, He's able to govern even these people of ultimate authority are ultimately, he is their authority, and they are governed by him. He leads princes away plundered, and he overthrows the mighty. He deprives the trusted ones of speech, and he takes away the discernment of the elders. That would possibly even apply towards them, but these are just general statements, and they're very true. When you read these, it's just a way of basically saying, of all of the constructs and the offices and the beliefs and the positions of men, they may be what they are, and in the earthly sense, among humans, there are those people who are at the pinnacle. They're at the peak of all of these things, and yet they're all governed by him. He's the one who has final say. This whole section is supposed to keep us mindful of that. No matter, and I've said this of recent because our world is changing so fast right before our eyes. And people are so worried about, well, what's this group of people doing? And what's that guy doing? And this guy's got that amount of power and that guy's got that amount of power. I think it's good for us to step back for a moment and say, I don't care how high up the food chain of mankind you go, they are all subject to God. At some day they will answer for everything that they do, and we ought to remember that nothing that they do, the fact that they could draw breath and wake up in the morning, is at his good pleasure. So let's not lose sleep over what these people are doing. God's ultimately in control of all those things, and even if it means the wrapping up of the things on this earth, that day was going to come no matter what. And so we know that because the scripture says so. If they're just part of his plan to bring that about at this particular time, step back and watch it take place. Keep your eyes on him, and whatever happens day to day, he knows it before it happens. So be aware of those things, but don't be consumed by them. Verse 21, he pours out contempt on princes and disarms the mighty. He uncovers deep things out of the darkness, and he brings the shadow of death to light. He makes nations great, and he destroys them. He enlarges nations and he guides them. So the ones that would seek him, he'll guide them. Those ones who do their things in their defiance of him, they're brought down. He takes away the understanding of chiefs and the people of the earth, and he makes them wander in pathless wilderness. They grope in the dark without light, and he makes them stagger like drunk men. This is Job's way of kind of closing this whole thing out. You guys keep telling me about the greatness of God. It's like, you're telling me things that I already know. That's how we started the chapter. So let me go ahead and be eloquent, better than any of the rest of them combined, about the greatness of God and his governing in the affairs of mankind. This is obvious in the physical world, the natural world, and among mankind. There's no debate in this, is Job's way of saying. So you guys think that somehow everything that you're saying to me is somehow profound, and yet it's just redundant and it's stuff that I already know. So it's his way of, the implication of it is, none of this stuff that you're saying is unknown to me. I know it very, very well. So your assumptions and your conclusions are completely wrong. You're not bringing something to me that I don't already know. Again, to close this, when it is that we are put in a place of speaking to someone, especially somebody who's in a place of deep hurt and trouble, it's okay if there's times when we're forceful about things, if we know something to be absolutely true. But we shouldn't assume that the person that we're talking to doesn't know things. It's better that we ask them, do you know these things, and let them speak about this. And sometimes it's better to listen than to speak in these kinds of matters. So these are the things that we can learn from this dialogue here. And it's really starting to ramp up to some very interesting conclusions. So we're going to pick up next week. It still continues with what Job has to say in his counsel, or his reply to what is the counsel given to him. And it does help us to see that Job has a very, very good understanding of things taking place around him. He's not he's not shut off to the reality of these things. In fact, if anything, he's much more aware of those things than maybe they even are, and certainly more so than they think, or than they might believe that he knows. So he's very much aware of them. Really fascinating. This is really beginning to pick up its pace a little bit, but some really profound things here. I genuinely hope that you're enjoying this. And by the way, I've noticed, because I do look at the amount of views that we get of the videos there on YouTube, and of all of the books that we're doing currently and have done for any length of time, right now currently and in recent history, the book of Job is getting the most amount of views of any of them. So it looks like people have a fascination with this book, and the conclusions that are there. And I genuinely hope that it's helpful to you and that it's beneficial in how we understand how God does what he does, that it offers to you comfort, and it also offers to us caution in how we interact with one another, especially when it's time when we are giving counsel to someone who is hurting and who has trouble. So with that, we will pick up next week, and I pray that if you read ahead, please do, and I hope that these studies prove beneficial to you. So we'll pick it up next week.